The operations map was lying to him. Colored arrows lunged toward Normandy, converging on the beaches like a steel fist about to close. But as General Leo Geyr von Schweppenberg stared at that wall of color on the night of June 7th, 1944, he knew the real battle was happening somewhere else entirely, out on the French roads, where his armored reserve was dying in ditches and burning in fields before it had ever seen an enemy tank. On paper, those arrows said one word: attack. The silence on his radios said something very different. For 2 years, he had prepared for this moment. For one day, he believed he might still throw the Allies back into the sea. By that night, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Hours earlier, everything had looked clear. Just after dawn on June 7th, in a headquarters west of Paris, Geyr had stood over that same table with something close to certainty. He commanded Panzer Group West, Germany's strategic armored reserve in France, and the pattern of markers on the map was his design. Panzer Lehr moving up from Chartres, the 12th SS Panzer Division pushing in from Lisieux. Other armored formations threading their way in from across France, all angling toward Normandy. On paper, it was a textbook counterstroke. The Allies had landed barely 24 hours earlier. The beachheads were still shallow, still fragile, still within range of a concentrated armored blow. If his panzers could close in and reach the coast by nightfall on June 8th, there was still a chance to break through, reach the waterline, and shove the invasion back into the English Channel. He had been preparing for this exact moment for 2 years. Panzer Lehr alone fielded more than 200 tanks and assault guns, plus hundreds of half-tracks and armored vehicles. The 12th SS Panzer Division added another heavy striking force. Together with the other formations under his coordination, he controlled the most powerful armored reserve in Western Europe. Enough steel, he believed, to crush any beachhead. He had learned one lesson over 4 decades in uniform: strike fast, strike hard, before the enemy can build up. He had studied every invasion scenario he could find. In his mind, the critical window was brutally clear: the first 48 to 72 hours. In that span, a concentrated panzer attack might break the Allied front, just as German armor had done at Dunkirk in 1940. On the morning of June 7th, nothing on his table suggested disaster. Panzer Lehr was already moving toward its assembly area. The 12th SS was advancing toward Caen. Railways and roads across France pulsed with German movement. The hammer, as he saw it, was rising. What he did not yet understand was that the roads themselves were now part of the battlefield. And on that battlefield, his panzers had already lost. The first reports after 900 hours sounded routine, almost trivial: a fuel convoy hit near Alençon, a column delayed by cratered roads south of Falaise, scattered mentions of enemy fighter bombers along approach routes, frictions of war, nothing more. Every campaign had them. No operation involving thousands of vehicles and tens of thousands of men ever unfolded exactly on schedule. His staff logged each report and adjusted the markers on the map. Timetables slipped by minutes here and there, but the overall picture still looked acceptable. Panzer Lehr was making progress. The 12th SS was still heading for Caen. Other units were moving into position. The counterattack remained possible. The arrows still seemed honest. Then, slowly, the tone of the messages shifted. A panzer battalion commander reported that his fuel trucks had been destroyed by fighter bombers near Argentan. The tanks under his command were now sitting in an orchard, engines cold, waiting for a resupply that might never arrive. A signals officer from the 12th SS sent word that his communications vehicles had been caught on an open road and raked with guns and bombs. 3 staff cars destroyed, 6 men killed. The regimental command net silent. By noon, it was no longer a handful of isolated incidents. It was a flood. Column attacked near Thury Harcourt. 14 vehicles destroyed. Ammunition convoy hit outside Geyr. Explosions continuing for 20 minutes as shells cook off. Tank transporters struck on the Falaise Road. 5 Panthers destroyed before they ever reached the front. A medical unit reported being strafed near Mortain. Its ambulances burning by the roadside. Wounded men dying in the twisted wrecks that were supposed to protect them. Around the map table, officers tried to impose order on the chaos. Operations staff argued that the divisions were still moving, that losses were painful but within the margins of a major campaign. Schedules had slipped, yes, but the counterattack could still go in. Geyr listened without comment. He was a veteran of an earlier kind of war, of Poland, of France in 1940, a war in which air attack was a nuisance, not a catastrophe. Back then, the Luftwaffe had dominated the sky. German columns had rolled forward in daylight, protected by their own fighters, confident that anything overhead was friendly. But the reports kept coming, and the pattern behind them grew darker with every passing hour. By mid-afternoon, the staff could see something they had never seen before. The attacks were not random. They were not occasional. They were systematic. Every major road leading toward Normandy seemed to be under watch. Every column that moved in daylight was being spotted and hit within minutes. The enemy behaved as if he could see exactly where German units were, particularly when they were most vulnerable, and exactly how to cut them apart. Something fundamental in warfare had changed, and Geyr was only beginning to grasp what that something was. From his headquarters, he could not see what the Allies had built in the air above France. By June 1944, the Western Allies possessed an air force of staggering size and sophistication. The American 8th and 9th Air Forces, combined with the Royal Air Force, could put thousands of aircraft over France on any given day. For the specific task of strangling German movement, they had created something entirely new, an integrated air-ground system designed to turn roads and railways into killing grounds. The spear point of that system was the fighter bomber. The American P-47 Thunderbolt was a monster of an aircraft, more than 7 tons of engine, armor, and firepower. It could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or 8 rockets and still retain enough performance to tangle with enemy fighters. Pilots called it the Jug, short for juggernaut. It could shrug off hits that would shatter lighter machines and keep flying. The British Hawker Typhoon was just as terrifying from the ground. Its wings bristled with rockets weighing around 60 pounds each, warheads capable of punching through the armor of most German vehicles. Typhoon pilots had spent months learning how to dive at the correct angle, at the correct height, to get their rockets and bombs on target while minimizing their own exposure. But the aircraft were only the teeth. The real weapon was the system feeding them targets. Months before D-Day, Allied planners had launched what they called the Transportation Plan, a systematic campaign to smash the arteries feeding German forces in France. In May 1944 alone, bombers dropped tens of thousands of tons of explosives on rail yards, from Paris to the English Channel. Bridges over the Seine and the Loire were methodically demolished. Key junctions and marshalling yards were cratered, repaired, and cratered again until they were all but unusable. The goal was simple and brutal. When the invasion came, German divisions would try to move, and they would find broken railways, destroyed bridges, and a road network that forced them into predictable choke points. Those choke points could then be patrolled from the air, and on June 7th they were. For the invasion itself, the Allies added something Geyr had never faced: real-time tactical control linking pilots in the sky to eyes on the ground. Mobile radar units, some mounted on trucks near the beaches, tracked aircraft moving across the battle area. Ground control centers maintained radio contact with fighter-bomber squadrons, ready to steer them toward anything spotted by reconnaissance flights or forward observers. Army liaison officers at corps and division headquarters could request airstrikes the way they might once have requested artillery. A report from a hedgerow or a church steeple could translate into rockets on target within minutes. Everything was bound together by radio nets and standardized procedures. Pilots knew what calls to expect. Controllers knew how to speak to them. The entire structure behaved almost like a living organism. A German column began to move on a French road. A reconnaissance pilot or forward observer saw dust, heard engines, or caught the glint of armor. A call went to a control center. Controllers vectored the nearest armed patrol. Minutes later, P-47s or Typhoons dropped out of the clouds, released bombs and rockets, and climbed away before ground gunners could even adjust their sights. Then another flight arrived, and another. German soldiers who lived through these attacks later described the same feeling. They were not marching toward battle. They were being hunted. There was no safe time of day, no truly safe route. No guarantee that even a small movement would go unnoticed. The sky seemed to have eyes everywhere, and those eyes were connected directly to weapons that could strike without warning. On June 7th, the P-47s of the American 9th Air Force alone flew more than 2,000 fighter-bomber sorties in support of Normandy. RAF Typhoons added hundreds more. From first light until nightfall, almost every major road within 100 kilometers of the beaches was under some form of Allied air patrol. Geyr's panzer divisions were not advancing into battle. They were driving into a trap whose jaws closed a little tighter with every hour that passed. By 1500 hours on June 7th, no amount of optimism could disguise the truth spilling into Panzer Group West headquarters. The reports were no longer describing disruption. They were describing disintegration. Panzer Lehr, the elite formation Geyr had expected to spearhead his counterstroke, was bleeding out on the road south of Caen. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, had already sent multiple urgent messages describing a march that no textbook of armored warfare had ever imagined. Columns caught in open country, fuel trucks burning, artillery tractors overturned on cratered roads, half-tracks scattered across orchards and drainage ditches as their crews dove for cover from circling aircraft. Bayerlein himself had barely survived the morning. His command car, traveling across a brief, exposed stretch near Argenteuil, was suddenly struck by P-47s diving out of the sun. Machine gun rounds shredded the vehicle, setting it ablaze. Bayerlein escaped only by hurling himself into a ditch, where he lay face down in mud while bullets whipped the grass around him. 2 of his staff officers died beside the wreck. The man chosen to lead the counterattack had spent the morning as a refugee in a roadside ditch, and this was only one story among dozens. The tanks themselves often survived. Panther armor could shrug off machine gun fire. A Panzer IV could live through a near miss. Unless a bomb landed close or a rocket hit square, the armored vehicles remained intact. But the armor meant nothing without the systems supporting it. Tanks cannot fight without fuel. They cannot fight without ammunition. They cannot fight without infantry, artillery, engineers, and communications units moving in coordination beside them. And those elements were being wiped out systematically. In Bayerlein's war diary, recovered after the war, his frustration was plain. In a single day's march, Panzer Lehr lost more than 80 vehicles to air attack. Most were soft-skinned transports, but the list included fuel carriers, maintenance trucks, command vehicles, radios, and yes, 5 tanks destroyed before they ever saw an Allied soldier. His division was being hollowed out before it had even reached the front. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, was suffering just as badly. Moving toward Caen from the east, its long columns found themselves exposed on roads that twisted through open fields. In the afternoon light, Typhoons descended on those columns in a series of perfectly timed dives. To the young soldiers of the 12th SS, many barely 18, it must have felt like something out of a nightmare. Veterans who had served on the Eastern Front described it as a kind of helplessness they had never known. Against Soviet tanks, at least you could shoot back. Against aircraft exploding from clouds with rockets slashing past your windshield, there was no defense, no warning, no fight to be had. At headquarters, Geyr's staff scrambled for solutions. They tried everything they could think of: reroute columns through forests, restrict movement to dawn and dusk, request Luftwaffe fighter cover to shield the advancing armor. The last request went unanswered. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now a shadow of itself. Attrition over the Reich had gutted its strength. Fuel shortages grounded many of the fighters that still remained. Those German aircraft that did rise over Normandy were outnumbered, outgunned, and often shot down before they even knew what hit them. On June 7th, the Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300 sorties over Normandy. The Allies flew more than 10,000. By evening, even the most determined optimism could no longer mask reality. The map still showed arrows converging on Normandy, but the reality behind those arrows had dissolved into chaos. Units were scattered, convoys destroyed, fuel nearly gone, communications shattered. The concentrated panzer blow Geyr had promised would not be happening on June 8th, perhaps not on June 9th, perhaps not at all. The moment of clarity came sometime after 2100 hours. The headquarters had quieted. Officers worked in side rooms, sorting through radio logs, casualty reports, and increasingly desperate messages from the divisions. Teleprinters clattered in mechanical rhythm. Radios murmured with broken transmissions. The air smelled of tobacco smoke, sweat, and damp paper. Geyr remained alone before the vast operations map. He stared at it for a long time. The map showed what should have been happening. Divisions converging on Caen, armored groups forming the hammer he had envisioned. But all day, he had read the truth in messages filled with words like destroyed, delayed, lost, scattered yet, and out of fuel. Panzer Lehr had lost nearly a third of its transport capacity in one day. Surviving fuel convoys were nearly empty, and future convoys were being blown apart before they reached the front. The 12th SS had reached the outskirts of Caen not as a unified division, but as fragments spread across miles of countryside, each short on fuel and ammunition. Other divisions were still far away, creeping along broken rail lines and cratered roads. Even if all of them reached Normandy, they would not arrive together. They would arrive piecemeal. This was the nightmare every armored commander feared, entering battle one unit at a time, exhausted and under strength, against an enemy whose reinforcements arrived faster and in greater numbers every hour. The Allies were landing more troops every tide, more tanks, more artillery, more supplies, more everything. By the time his panzers could mass, the enemy beachhead would be too strong to crack. He had spent his entire career studying how to move armor across hostile ground, how to mass force, how to strike with decisive weight, but never, in any scenario, had he faced an opponent who could see every movement from the sky and strike every road at will. He had been preparing for one kind of war. He was fighting another, a war where mobility itself had become a vulnerability, where the approach march was the battle, where units were destroyed before they even deployed. By midnight, Geyr knew the truth the map refused to show him. The counterattack he had planned no longer existed. The window, those critical 48 to 72 hours, had already closed. Over the next days, the consequences unfolded exactly as he had feared. Panzer Lehr eventually engaged British forces around Tilly-sur-Seulles, and the 12th SS fought with a ferocity that stunned even their opponents. German tank crews, many hardened by years on the Eastern Front, carved out isolated tactical victories, but the strategic moment was gone. By June 9th, over 300,000 Allied troops were ashore. By June 12th, more than 400,000 tanks, guns, ammunition, fuel, all of it flowed across the beaches in quantities Germany could no longer match. Whatever might have been possible on June 7th had become impossible by June 10th. The counterattack was never launched. The armored reserve that might have shattered the invasion was instead fed into a grinding defensive struggle where it slowly bled away, and the Allies grew stronger every hour. Then, on June 10th, 3 days after D-Day, Allied intelligence located Geyr's headquarters near the village of La Caine. Reconnaissance flights, radio intercepts, and French resistance reports pinpointed the concentration of vehicles and communications equipment. Shortly before 1900 hours, RAF Typhoons and medium bombers descended on the compound. Bombs and rockets tore through the chateau grounds. Staff officers were killed at their desks. Communications equipment was obliterated. Maps and plans were shredded or set ablaze. Geyr himself was struck by shrapnel as he tried to reach shelter. Panzer Group West ceased to exist as a functioning headquarters in a matter of minutes. Geyr was evacuated to a hospital, then relieved of command, and with him went Germany's final hope of coordinating an armored blow strong enough to change the course of the invasion. In his post-war reflections, Geyr did not blame his officers or his soldiers. He blamed himself and every German commander who had failed to understand how radically warfare had evolved. The decisive battle, he wrote, was not fought on the beaches. It was fought on the roads leading to the beaches, where Allied air power annihilated Germany's last chance to concentrate force. The struggle for Normandy would drag on for 2 more brutal months. German divisions fought with skill and valor. They made the Allies pay for every hedgerow, every village, every crossroads, but nothing they did could change the equation written on June 7th. The initiative had passed to the Allies, and it would never return. When we ask what decided the fate of D-Day, the easy answer points to Omaha Beach or Pegasus Bridge. But the deeper truth lies in the burning convoys scattered across the French countryside. The men who stormed the beaches earned their place in history, but so did the pilots, controllers, radar operators, and planners who built a system that destroyed Germany's armored reserve before it could fight. In 1940, German armor had raced across France, while the sky was contested but survivable. In 1944, the same strategy broke against a new kind of warfare. A war dominated by systems, networks, and information. A war where the side controlling the sky controlled everything beneath it. A war Germany had already lost before the first Panzer left its barracks. General Geyr von Schweppenberg learned that truth in a single, devastating day. And modern warfare has lived by it ever since. Control the sky, and you control the war. If this deeper look at D-Day made you see the battle beyond the beaches, out on the roads, in the skies, and inside the systems that decided everything, hit like and subscribe. We bring forgotten World War II stories back to life, with the context, the nuance, and the human angles that history books often leave behind. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments and help keep these stories alive.